The sky above was a brilliant blue, the kind of flawless, sunny day that made everything seem a little bit more hopeful. Jamal Washington glanced over at his wife, Keisha, sitting in the passenger seat, a content smile on her face as she flipped through her phone. Their daughter, Layla, was in the back seat, humming along to a song playing faintly on the car stereo. They were on the final leg of a road trip that had been long overdue, a small family vacation to escape the daily grind of their lives in the city. Jamal smiled to himself. The trip had been exactly what they needed. They had stopped by national parks, taken pictures at scenic overlooks, and even treated themselves to a day at a local amusement park. Layla had been thrilled. But now, as they approached the outskirts of a small, quiet town, hunger began to creep in. "Okay, what are we thinking? Burgers? Sandwiches?" Jamal asked, glancing at Keisha with a grin. "I'm pretty sure Layla would eat a pizza the size of the car right now." Layla chimed in from the back, "Pizza." "Yes, pizza. Can we please?" Keisha laughed, shaking her head. "Let's see what this town has to offer first. I don't think they have pizza joints everywhere." They slowed as they approached the town's main street, a quaint, picturesque stretch lined with old-fashioned buildings, the kind you'd expect to see in small towns where everyone knows everyone. There was a cozy-looking diner up ahead with a neon sign flashing open. In cursive letters, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed much since the 1950s. "There's a diner," Jamal said, pointing. "How about we give it a try? Looks like the kind of place that serves up big burgers and fries." Keisha nodded in agreement, and Layla, though initially disappointed about the pizza, chirped, "I'll have a milkshake then." Jamal turned the car into the small gravel lot beside the diner. The tires crunched under the weight of the vehicle as they pulled into a spot near the door. The diner looked inviting, enough vintage red booths visible through the large glass windows, a couple of patrons chatting over their meals. Jamal noticed an older man reading a newspaper at the counter and a waitress busy serving coffee. It looked peaceful. As the Washingtons stepped out of the car, Jamal stretched his arms above his head, breathing in the warm, crisp air. Layla hopped out energetically, her curls bouncing as she spun in circles for a moment, releasing all the pent-up energy from the car ride. "Okay, kiddo, let's save some of that energy for after lunch," Keisha said, her voice light as she adjusted Layla's jacket and fixed a stray curl. She turned to Jamal. "Let's hope this place has good food. I'm starving." Jamal smiled and reached for the diner door, pulling it open for his family. The small bell above the door jingled as they walked in, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. At first it was subtle. The low chatter of the patrons dwindled, and the waitress, a woman in her early 50s with a short bob and a hard expression, looked up from where she was wiping the counter. Her eyes landed on the Washington family, and something flickered in her gaze, something unwelcoming, though she masked it with a tight-lipped smile. The patrons turned their heads, some casting quick, curious glances, others holding their gaze for just a second too long. Jamal felt it. That shift in the air, the kind of tension he'd grown all too familiar with over the years. He exchanged a glance with Keisha, who gave him a reassuring smile, but he could see the unease creeping into her eyes. It was the same look she got whenever they encountered those little, subtle signs that they weren't always welcome. Still, Jamal brushed it off. He was used to it. They were just here for a meal, after all. What harm could there be? They stood by the entrance for a moment, waiting to be seated. The waitress kept her focus on the counter, seemingly in no rush to acknowledge them. After a couple of awkward moments, Jamal decided to take the initiative. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Are we supposed to seat ourselves, or?" The waitress looked up, her expression neutral but distant. "We're full," she said curtly, her voice lacking any real warmth. Jamal glanced around the diner. There were empty tables, plenty of them. Maybe half the diner was occupied at best. His brow furrowed slightly, but he kept his voice calm. "Are you sure? I see a couple of open tables right over there." The waitress's lips pressed into a thin line. "Those are reserved," she said, not bothering to hide her annoyance this time. "We've got some regulars coming in soon." Keisha stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "We don't mind waiting for a table if it's going to be a while. We're just looking for somewhere to eat. We're on a road trip with our daughter." The waitress's eyes flickered to Layla, who was standing quietly, clutching her mom's hand. For a moment her expression softened, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a dismissive shrug. "I'm sorry, but like I said, we're full," the waitress repeated, turning her back to them and returning to her task of wiping down the already spotless counter. Jamal felt a slow burn of anger rise in his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. He had encountered situations like this before, but it never got easier. He didn't want to make a scene, not in front of Layla. "It's okay," Keisha whispered, touching his arm gently. "Let's just go somewhere else." But before they could turn to leave, Layla tugged on Jamal's jacket. "Why won't they let us eat here, Daddy?" Jamal's heart clenched at her innocent question, her wide, curious eyes looking up at him, not yet able to understand the complexities of the world. He crouched down to her level, forcing a smile. "They're just really busy, sweetie," he said softly, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "We'll find another place, okay?" Layla frowned but nodded. "Okay." Just as Jamal stood up, ready to lead his family out, the door to the diner swung open, and an older white man in his 70s strolled in. His presence was immediately met with warmth from the waitress. "Morning, Bill," the waitress called, her face lighting up in a way it hadn't when the Washingtons entered. "Your usual seat's ready for you." Bill glanced at the Washington family, his eyes narrowing slightly as if registering something he didn't like. He made his way to the counter, but not before stopping in front of Jamal. "You folks lost or something?" he asked, his tone casual but carrying a subtle edge. "Don't think I've seen you around here before." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Just passing through. We were hoping to get something to eat." The older man chuckled, a sound that was more condescending than friendly. "Well, this diner isn't for everyone. Best you try the place a few miles down the road more suited to folks like you." Keisha inhaled sharply, her hand tightening around Jamal's arm. Jamal could feel the tension radiating from her, and it took everything in him not to snap at the man. But he held back. He knew that if he lost his temper, it would only reinforce whatever racist assumptions this man already had. Before Jamal could respond, the diner owner, Bill, appeared from the back. He was a tall, heavy-set man in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of years in the business. His eyes moved from Jamal to his family, and his expression soured immediately. "What's going on here?" Gladys Bill asked the waitress, his voice gruff. "Nothing. Just letting these folks know we're full," she replied with a pointed look at Jamal and Keisha. Bill looked the Washington family up and down, his expression hardening. "Yeah, we're full. You better move along." Jamal felt the weight of the injustice hit him squarely in the chest. Here they were, a family just trying to have a meal, and they were being treated like they didn't belong, like they were less than human. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, a familiar voice called from the entrance. "What's going on here?" Jamal turned to see Andre Pierce, his old college friend and now a high-powered civil rights lawyer, walking into the diner. Andre was dressed in a sharp suit, looking every bit the part of a man who was used to being taken seriously. His presence immediately commanded attention. Jamal's shoulders relaxed slightly at the sight of Andre, though the tension in the room remained palpable. "We were just about to leave," Jamal said quietly, though the frustration was evident in his tone. Andre raised an eyebrow as he looked between Jamal and the diner owner. "Leave? Why?" The waitress's face twisted slightly in discomfort, and Bill cleared his throat, clearly growing uneasy. "We're full," Bill muttered. Andre glanced around the diner, his sharp eyes taking in the half-empty room. "Doesn't look full to me." The tension in the air grew thick as the silence stretched. Andre's gaze remained locked on Bill's, unflinching, as he waited for the man's response. Finally, Bill shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering under the weight of Andre's stare. "Look, it's just not a good time," Bill said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. Andre's lips curved into a small, humorless smile. "Right. I see how it is." Jamal watched the exchange, a mixture of relief and anger swirling inside him. He was glad Andre had shown up, but the fact that it had come to this, being denied service for no reason other than the color of their skin, left a bitter taste in his mouth. Layla tugged on Keisha's hand. can we go now?" Keisha nodded, her voice tight as she spoke. "Yes, baby, we're going." As they turned to leave, Andre placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, his expression serious. "Hold on a second," he said quietly. "You don't have to leave. Not like this." Jamal hesitated. Part of him wanted to stay and fight, but another part of him, the part that was tired of these battles, just wanted to walk away, to let it go for the sake of his family. But Andre wasn't done yet. Turning back to Bill, Andre's voice dropped to a calm, measured tone. "You know, refusing service based on race is illegal, right?" Bill's face flushed. "I didn't refuse service." Andre raised a hand, cutting him off. "I'm a lawyer. I know exactly what this looks like." The silence in the diner was deafening. Everyone was watching now, their gazes shifting nervously between Andre and the diner owner. Bill swallowed hard, his confidence visibly crumbling. He was caught, and he knew it. Jamal stood frozen for a moment, taking in the weight of Andre's words. The mood in the diner had shifted from hostile to uncomfortable, with the patrons glancing nervously between the Washington family and the owner, Bill. Keisha, still holding Layla's hand, squeezed her husband's arm gently, urging him to move forward. They were so used to this, to avoiding conflict, to walking away, but this time felt different. Andre stood confidently, his presence commanding the room in a way that couldn't be ignored. Jamal admired how calm his friend remained, even as the tension in the diner thickened. Jamal, on the other hand, could feel the anger boiling beneath his skin, but years of experience had taught him to keep his emotions in check. He had to think of his family first, always. Andre hadn't moved. He was still staring at Bill, who seemed increasingly uneasy under the scrutiny. Bill, who had initially looked so sure of himself when he told the Washingtons to leave, now seemed unsure, flustered even, his weathered face turning red with frustration and something else, perhaps fear. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Bill said, his voice gruff but no longer as confident as it had been moments earlier. His eyes darted to the other patrons, some of whom were now murmuring amongst themselves. He seemed to realize that the situation was spiraling out of his control. Andre gave him a small, cold smile. "Trouble? No, I don't think you want any of that. But what you've done here, refusing service to a family based on the color of their skin, that's illegal, and I think you know it." Bill's gaze flickered, his jaw tightening. "I didn't refuse anyone." "Yes, you did," Andre cut in, his tone sharp but still calm. "You made it very clear that they aren't welcome here. And unless you have a valid reason for not serving them besides the fact that they don't look like your regulars, you're violating their rights. I don't need to explain how serious that is." The patrons of the diner had grown silent, all eyes fixed on the unfolding confrontation. The waitress, Gladys, was standing near the counter, wringing her hands nervously, unsure of what to do. She exchanged a quick glance with Bill, but neither of them spoke. Jamal, still processing the situation, glanced at Keisha, whose expression mirrored his own mix of emotions: frustration, anger, exhaustion. It was a familiar feeling, one they had both experienced far too often. But this time Jamal didn't want to leave. He didn't want to walk away. Not when Andre was standing up for them. Layla, sensing the tension, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, can we go now? I'm hungry." Keisha smiled down at her daughter, but it was a strained smile. "We'll go soon, baby." Andre shifted his focus to Layla for a moment, his expression softening. Then he turned back to Bill. "You see, this little girl just wants to have a meal with her family. It's really that simple. So what's it going to be? You going to do the right thing here, or are we going to have to take this a lot further than it needs to go?" Bill's face was a storm of emotions now: anger, confusion, and what seemed to be a dawning realization of the potential consequences of his actions. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words didn't come. Suddenly, one of the patrons, a middle-aged man sitting at the counter, stood up and cleared his throat. "Look, no need to make this into a big deal," he said, his voice gruff but trying to sound reasonable. "Maybe they can just eat their meal and be on their way. No harm done, right?" Andre turned his gaze to the man, his smile cold. "No harm done? You think it's that simple? This family walked in here expecting nothing more than a meal, and instead they got treated like second-class citizens. That's not something we just walk away from." The man shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. Andre's words hung in the air, and the silence that followed was thick with tension. Bill, seeing that he was cornered, finally sighed heavily and wiped a hand over his face. "Fine," he muttered, clearly annoyed but unwilling to escalate things any further. "They can sit." Andre smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Good choice." He turned to Jamal and Keisha, nodding toward one of the empty booths. "Take a seat." Jamal hesitated for a moment, unsure if he really wanted to sit in a place where they had been so blatantly disrespected. But Keisha gave him a slight nod, her eyes saying more than words could. They deserved this. They weren't going to be run off like they were less than anyone else. Jamal nodded back and led his family to the booth. Layla, still oblivious to the deeper complexities of what had just happened, climbed happily into the seat. The Washingtons sat down, the tension still lingering in the air like a heavy cloud. Gladys, the waitress, slowly approached their table, her face set in an awkward, forced smile. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice lacking the warmth she had shown other customers. Keisha glanced at Jamal, then spoke up, her voice firm but calm. "We'll have a couple of burgers, fries, and a chocolate milkshake for our daughter." Gladys scribbled the order down without looking at them and disappeared back toward the kitchen. Jamal exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the table as he tried to calm the adrenaline still surging through his veins. Keisha reached over and placed her hand on top of his, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "You okay?" she asked softly. Jamal nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed it himself. "Yeah, just tired, you know." Keisha smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know." Andre had taken a seat at the counter, still watching the room with a sharp, assessing gaze. Jamal knew that Andre wasn't done yet, that he was ready to step in again if needed. It was one of the things he had always admired about his friend. Andre had always been willing to fight for what was right, even when it meant making people uncomfortable. The silence in the diner stretched on, the other patrons pretending to be engrossed in their meals but occasionally sneaking glances at the Washington family. Jamal could feel their eyes on him, on Keisha, and especially on Layla, as if they were an anomaly, something to be studied from a distance. It was a strange feeling being in a place where you weren't wanted but knowing you had every right to be there. Jamal had experienced it so many times before, but it never got any easier. He didn't want Layla to grow up with that same weight on her shoulders. He wanted her to be free, to live in a world where she wouldn't have to second-guess whether she belonged. But today wasn't that day. Not yet. As they waited for their food, the door to the diner opened again, and in walked a man who immediately drew attention. He was tall and dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, his shoes gleaming as he strode confidently into the room. His hair was graying at the temples, and his face was lined with age, but he carried himself with an air of authority that made people sit up and take notice. Bill's eyes widened slightly as the man approached, and Jamal noticed a flash of recognition in his expression. The man walked straight to the counter, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on Bill. "Bill," the man said, his voice low but commanding. "I heard there was some trouble here today." Bill's face paled slightly. "Mr. Reynolds, it was just a misunderstanding. Nothing to worry about." Mr. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to the Washingtons, who were sitting quietly at their booth. Jamal could feel the weight of the man's eyes on him, and something about his presence made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "I don't think it's nothing, Bill," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice cold. "I think you might have caused yourself quite a bit of trouble here today." Bill swallowed hard, his bravado from earlier completely gone. "I didn't mean for, I just—" "Save it," Mr. Reynolds interrupted, cutting him off with a wave of his hand. "I know exactly what happened, and I know exactly who you're dealing with." The tension in the room ratcheted up even higher as Mr. Reynolds turned to face Andre, who was still sitting calmly at the counter, his expression unreadable. "Andre Pierce," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice carrying a note of respect. "I didn't expect to see you here." Andre's lips curved into a small smile, though there was no warmth in it. "I didn't expect to be here either. But it seems your friend Bill has a problem with serving people who don't look like him." Mr. Reynolds let out a low sigh, shaking his head slowly. Bill," he muttered under his breath. You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you? Bill looked confused, his eyes darting between Mr. Reynolds and Andre. I don't understand. Mr. Reynolds turned to face Bill fully, his expression hard. Andre Pierce is one of the most prominent civil rights lawyers in the state. His name is known far and wide for holding people accountable, people like you. And if you think for 1 second that this little stunt you pulled today is going to go unnoticed, you're in for a rude awakening. Bill's face drained of color, and Jamal could almost see the gears turning in his head as he began to fully realize the gravity of the situation. Bill stammered, looking completely lost. Mr. Reynolds didn't give him a chance to finish. You need to fix this, Bill. Now, before this turns into something that can't be undone. The silence in the diner was suffocating as everyone waited for Bill's response. The weight of Mr. Reynolds' words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Jamal could see the panic building in the diner owner's eyes. Finally, Bill let out a long, shaky breath. I'll take care of it. Mr. Reynolds nodded, satisfied, and turned back to Andre. You should have no more problems here. I'll make sure of it. Andre gave a curt nod. Good, because if there are, I'll make sure the consequences are swift and severe. With that, Mr. Reynolds turned on his heel and strode out of the diner, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Bill stood frozen for a moment, then slowly turned to face Andre, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. I'm sorry, Bill muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean. Andre stood up from the counter, fixing Bill with a cold stare. It's too late for apologies, Bill. You've shown who you are. Now you have to live with it. With that, Andre turned and walked over to the Washington's table. You ready to go? He asked Jamal quietly. Jamal nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. They had won, in a way, but the victory felt hollow. The ugliness of what had happened still lingered in the air, and no apology could erase that. Yeah, Jamal said softly. We're ready. They stood up together, and as they left the diner, Jamal couldn't help but glance back over his shoulder. Bill was still standing there, looking small and defeated, his once proud diner now filled with the weight of a shame he couldn't shake. The Washington family walked out into the bright afternoon sun, leaving the diner and its ugliness behind. But even as they moved forward, Jamal knew the weight of what had happened would stay with them for a long time. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the small town as Jamal, Keisha, Layla, and Andre walked away from the diner, their footsteps echoing on the quiet street. Jamal felt a strange mix of relief and lingering frustration settling in his chest. The confrontation was over, but the wound it left behind was still fresh, raw. They had won in the most technical sense. They had forced Bill and the diner staff to confront their racism and had secured their right to sit and eat in the establishment. But even as Jamal walked away from the scene, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a small victory in a much larger, more exhausting battle. Keisha was quiet as she walked beside him, holding Layla's hand. Layla, for her part, seemed to have moved on from the tension, skipping slightly as she hummed a tune, her mood unaffected by the conflict she was too young to fully comprehend. Jamal turned to Andre, who was walking with his hands in his pockets, his brow furrowed in thought. Thanks for stepping in back there, man, Jamal said, breaking the silence. Andre nodded, his expression softening. Of course. You shouldn't have had to deal with that in the first place. But it's not over, Jamal. Jamal sighed, already knowing what his friend was going to say. I know, he replied, but sometimes it feels like we're fighting the same fight over and over again. It never really ends, does it? Andre paused, glancing back at the diner they had just left behind. No, it doesn't. Not yet, anyway. His voice was low, filled with the weight of someone who had spent years battling these injustices in the courtroom and in real life. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. They continued walking, the rhythmic sound of their footsteps filling the silence again. As they reached the small park at the end of the street, Layla tugged on Keisha's hand. Mommy, can I play on the swing? She asked, her voice filled with the innocent excitement of a child who had no idea what her parents had just endured. Keisha smiled, bending down to brush a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. Of course, baby. Go ahead. Layla ran off toward the swings, her laughter ringing out as she raced to claim the one closest to the large oak tree at the center of the park. Jamal watched her, a mixture of pride and sadness welling up inside him. He wanted to protect her from the ugliness of the world for as long as possible, but he knew that one day sooner than he wanted she would experience it for herself. It was inevitable. Keisha and Jamal sat down on a nearby bench, the wooden slats creaking slightly under their weight. Andre remained standing, leaning against a nearby tree, his gaze still fixed on the distant diner. For a moment, none of them spoke. The breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and the sound of Layla's laughter filled the air, a reminder of the innocence they were all trying to preserve. "I hate that we have to go through this," Keisha said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but heavy with the emotion she had been holding back since the diner. "Every time we walk into a place like that, I can feel it. The stares, the judgment. And we just take it. We brush it off like it's nothing because we've gotten so used to it." Jamal reached over, taking her hand in his. "I know, Keisha, but what else can we do? We have to keep going, for Layla's sake." Keisha nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I just want her to grow up in a world where she doesn't have to deal with this, where she can walk into a diner or a store and just be human, where we don't have to worry about whether or not we'll be treated like we belong." Jamal squeezed her hand gently, understanding the depth of her pain. He wanted that world too, more than anything. But as much as they wanted to shield Layla from the harsh realities of life, they knew that the world wasn't going to change overnight. Andre, who had been quietly observing the conversation, stepped forward. "The truth is, it's going to be a long road before we get there," he said, his voice firm but compassionate. "But we can't let that stop us. Every time we push back, every time we stand our ground, we're making a difference. Maybe it's small, maybe it doesn't feel like enough, but it's something." Jamal looked up at his friend, seeing the fire in his eyes. Andre had always been the fighter, the one who wouldn't back down, no matter how steep the odds. It was why he had gone into civil rights law, why he had made it his mission to fight for people like Jamal, Keisha, and Layla. It was also why Jamal knew that, despite everything, they couldn't afford to give up. "I hear you," Jamal said, nodding slowly. "It's just hard. Sometimes it feels like no matter what we do, things stay the same." Andre's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "I get that. Believe me, I do. But every time we push back, every time we refuse to be silent, we're forcing people to see us. We're showing Layla that it's okay to stand up for yourself. That's what matters." Jamal nodded, though the weariness of the day still weighed heavily on him. He glanced over at Layla, who was now soaring high on the swings, her face lit up with pure joy. She deserved a world that didn't see her as less, that didn't judge her based on the color of her skin. Keisha leaned against Jamal's shoulder, her voice soft but resolute. "I know we have to keep fighting. I wish it wasn't always us. I wish we didn't always have to be the ones teaching the lesson." Andre sighed, his expression reflecting Keisha's frustration. "Yeah, but that's the thing about change. It doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come fast. People like Bill, they've lived their whole lives in this bubble, thinking the world is supposed to work one way. It takes a lot to break through that." Jamal exhaled, feeling the weight of those words. "And what about us? What do we do when we're tired of fighting?" Andre looked at him, his gaze steady. "We lean on each other. We find strength in our community, in the people who understand what we're going through. And we keep pushing forward, even when it feels impossible. Because if we don't, who will?" Jamal stared at the ground for a moment, letting Andre's words sink in. He knew his friend was right. As much as he hated the burden they had to carry, he also knew that walking away wasn't an option. Not for them, not for Layla, and not for the generations that would come after her. "Thanks, Andre," Jamal said finally, lifting his head and meeting his friend's gaze. "I appreciate you standing up for us today. I don't know if I could have kept my cool like you did." Andre smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You did exactly what you needed to do. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not give them the reaction they want. You kept your head, Jamal. That's more than a lot of people could do in a situation like that." Keisha nodded in agreement, squeezing Jamal's hand. "You always handle things with grace, even when it's hard. That's one of the reasons I love you." Jamal felt a warmth spread through him at her words, despite the heaviness of the day. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for his family and for the love they shared. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the park, Jamal felt a sense of peace settling in, even if it was only temporary. They had faced something ugly today, but they had come out of it stronger, together. Layla's laughter echoed through the park as she swung higher and higher, oblivious to the weight of the world that her parents carried. Watching her, Jamal made a silent vow to do whatever it took to protect her, to fight for her future, even when it felt like the world was against them. "Come on," Keisha said softly, standing up from the bench and tugging on Jamal's hand. "Let's go home." Jamal stood, pulling Keisha into a brief hug before releasing her. He turned to Andre, who was still standing nearby, his expression thoughtful. "You coming with us? We've got leftovers from last night and I think we all could use a good meal." Andre smiled, shaking his head. "I appreciate it, but I've got some things I need to take care of. You go enjoy time with your family. But let's catch up soon, okay?" "Absolutely," Jamal replied, clapping Andre on the back. "Thanks again, man. I don't know what we'd do without you." Andre waved off the thanks with a grin. "Just doing my part. You all take care." With that, Andre gave them a final nod and headed off down the street, his silhouette disappearing into the evening light. Jamal watched him go for a moment, then turned back to Keisha and Layla, who was now skipping back toward them from the swings, her face glowing with happiness. "Daddy, Mommy, can we get ice cream on the way home?" Layla asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Jamal chuckled, feeling a sense of normalcy return. "I think we can manage that," he said, wrapping an arm around Keisha as they began to walk down the sidewalk, Layla skipping along beside them. As they walked toward the car, Jamal took one last look back at the diner, now fading into the distance. He knew there would be more days like today, more battles to fight, more injustices to face. But for now, he was content to focus on the small, precious moments with his family, moments that made all the struggles worth it. In the fading light of the day, with the sound of Layla's laughter filling the air, Jamal realized that no matter how many battles they had to fight, they would always have each other. And that, in the end, was what mattered most.